Welcome back, Seekers. I hope everyone is staying warm and safe as the winter storms blow through our respective areas. Tonight, we journey to Indiana to explore the forgotten and perhaps unknown historical tragedies that have scarred the grounds that many call home. So grab those drinks, sit back, and join us again as we venture into the unknown. When people think of Indiana, they picture quiet cornfields, winding rivers, small towns stitched together by highways. But 4 centuries ago, this land was anything but peaceful. In the 1600s, long before Indiana had a name, it became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in North American history, a place where entire nations were driven from their homelands, where villages burned, hunting grounds became killing fields, and rivers carried the echoes of war. This was the era of the Beaver War, a conflict so vast, so violent, that it reshaped the destiny of the Midwest and left Indiana soaked in blood. The Beaver War began around 1640, but its roots stretch back even earlier to a single animal, the beaver. In Europe, beaver pelts were worth their weight in gold. Hats, coats, luxury goods, entire economies revolved around them. And in North America, the richest beaver lands lay deep in the forests of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. At the center of this conflict stood the Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 5, later 6, nations based in what is now New York. Armed with firearms supplied by the Dutch and later the English, the Iroquois set out to dominate the fur trade by force, and Indiana stood directly in their path. By the 1670s, Iroquois war parties were moving west in force. Muskets replaced bows, steel replaced stone. Entire villages fell in lightning-fast raids. Indiana, rich in rivers and beaver habitat, became a prime target. By 1680, the Iroquois had reached the height of their power. That year marked one of the most devastating events in Midwestern history, the attack on the great village of the Illinois. A massive Iroquois war party descended upon the Illini homeland. The assault was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. Villages were destroyed. Survivors fled in terror. The Illini and their allies, including the Miami, were driven west across the Mississippi River. Indiana was left nearly empty. What followed was a grim transformation. The land became an enormous Iroquois hunting preserve, patrolled by armed war bands. Any rival troop found in the region risked annihilation. The Miami, Potawatomi, and Illini were scattered, broken, and displaced. For nearly a decade, Indiana was ruled by fear, but exile did not mean defeat. In the 1680s and 1690s, the displaced tribes regrouped, and they were no longer alone. To the north stood New France, and the French quickly realized a terrifying truth. If the Iroquois controlled Indiana and the Ohio Valley, the French fur trade would collapse. So, the French made a choice. They forged a powerful alliance with the so-called Western tribes, the Miami, Illini, Potawatomi, and others. Firearms and ammunition flowed west. French soldiers marched alongside native warriors, and for the first time, the Iroquois faced organized resistance. From the forests and river valleys of Indiana, the counter-war began. The Miami and Illini returned east, not as refugees, but as raiders. They struck Iroquois hunting parties along the Wabash River, the St. Joseph River, and deep in the Indiana wilderness. Small mobile war bands used ambush tactics, cutting down supply lines and making the region increasingly dangerous. The French escalated the conflict even further, launching expeditions directly into the Iroquois heartland in New York. What followed was a brutal war of attrition. Villages were destroyed on both sides. Prisoners were taken or killed. Entire hunting seasons were lost to violence. The beaver population itself began to collapse from decades of overtrapping, turning once valuable land into an economic wasteland. Indiana was no longer profitable, and that changed everything. In 1684, the war reached a turning point at the siege of Fort St. Louis, near modern-day Illinois. An Iroquois force attempted to destroy the French Allied stronghold, a decisive blow meant to shatter Western resistance once and for all. But the attack failed. The fort held. For the first time, the Iroquois Western expansion had reached its limit. From that moment on, the momentum shifted. Continued guerrilla warfare made Indiana too costly to control. Iroquois losses mounted. Their monopoly fractured. And after decades of bloodshed, exhaustion set in. In 1701, the war finally ended with the Great Peace of Montreal, one of the most significant treaties in North American history. Displaced tribes were allowed to return to their homeland. The Miami reestablished themselves in Indiana, founding a powerful capital at Tecumseh, today's Fort Wayne. The Potawatomi settled across northern Indiana's lakes and wetlands, and the Illini rebuilt their shattered nation. But Indiana was no longer the same. These tribes returned as part of a broader French Native alliance, reshaping the region's politics, trade, and military power for the next 60 years. Indiana would remain a Miami stronghold, never absorbed into an Iroquois empire. The true number of dead will never be known. There were no census records, no mass graves counted, no names written down. But historians agree on one thing. The Beaver War and the Great Counterattack rank among the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Entire villages vanished. Nations were nearly erased. Indiana's population was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Its forests haunted by memories of fire, gunpowder, and flight. Even the land itself bore scars. Beaver populations collapsed. Trade networks shifted. A new economy emerged from the ruins of the old. Today, the Beaver War is rarely mentioned. But if you walk Indiana's riverbanks, if you stand in the forests near the Wabash, you're standing on ground once soaked in centuries-old conflict. Indiana survived, not as an Iroquois empire, but as a homeland reclaimed by those who refused to disappear. And that legacy of resistance, survival, and unimaginable loss still lingers beneath the soil. Long before Indiana was a state, before its towns had names, before maps could agree on where borders even were, this already blood-soaked land would again be host to the Red Rivers of war. The American Revolution had ended. The British were gone, at least on paper, and a brand new nation, fragile and untested, set its eyes westward. What stood in the way wasn't an empty wilderness. It was a confederation of native nations, experienced, organized, and fighting for survival. And in October of 1790, in the forests and river valleys of northeastern Indiana, the United States Army would suffer its first great disaster. This is the story of Harmar's defeat. After decades of conflict like the Beaver Wars, the Ohio Valley had already seen its share of violence, but nothing compared to what was about to unfold. The American government believed the Northwest Territory, modern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, was theirs by right of victory over Britain. Native nations disagreed. To them, the British defeat changed nothing. This land was still theirs. At the heart of Native resistance stood a powerful alliance known today as the Northwestern Indiana Confederacy. Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, and others had united under capable war leaders, none more formidable than a Miami chief named Little Turtle. His stronghold was Tecumseh, the Miami capital, located at the strategic meeting point of three rivers, where the St. Mary's and St. Joseph form the Maumee. Today, we call that place Fort Wayne, Indiana. In 1790, it was the beating heart of native power in the region. President George Washington knew the stakes. If the United States failed to assert control of the Northwest Territory, the nation's western expansion and credibility could collapse. So Washington turned to Brigadier General Josiah Harmar, ordering him to lead an expedition deep into native territory and destroy Tecumseh. Harmar assembled a force of over 1,400 men at Fort Washington, present-day Cincinnati. But this army was deeply flawed. Only a fraction was trained federal regulars. The rest were short-term militia, poorly trained, poorly disciplined, and utterly unprepared for frontier warfare. The plan was ambitious, a pincher movement. Harmar would strike north toward Tecumseh, while another force under John Hamtramck distracted native warriors along the Wabash River. But almost immediately, the plan unraveled. Hamtramck's forces refused to advance, and with that single failure, Harmar marched straight into a trap. As Harmar approached Tecumseh, native scouts made sure he saw what they wanted him to see: small groups of warriors appearing to retreat. Harmar took the bait. On October 19th, he sent 300 men under Colonel John Hardin to pursue them. What Hardin's detachment did not know was that Little Turtle had already positioned warriors in the woods ahead. The ambush was devastating. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The militia panicked almost instantly, breaking ranks and fleeing back toward Harmar's main force. The regulars stood their ground and paid for it with their lives. Many were cut down where they stood. Others were hunted through the woods. It was the first blow, and it would not be the last. When Harmar finally reached Tecumseh, he found it abandoned. Little Turtle had ordered the city burned, denying the Americans food, shelter, and supplies. The Miami had melted back into the forest, leaving Harmar with nothing to claim as a victory. Frustrated and humiliated, Harmar ordered the destruction of surrounding villages and thousands of bushels of corn, an act meant to starve the Confederacy into submission. Instead, it hardened native resolve, and it ensured the fighting was not over. As Harmar began his retreat south, he made one final fatal decision. He sent a detachment of elite regulars, around 60 men, led by Major John Willis, back toward Tecumseh to ambush any warriors returning to the ruins. Little Turtle anticipated the move perfectly. At dawn on October 22nd, as the Americans crossed near the Maumee River, native warriors struck from concealed positions in the woods and cornfields. This time, there was no panic, only annihilation. The regulars were caught in a deadly crossfire. Men fell into the river, weighed down by equipment, drowning as bullets tore through the water. Others fought hand to hand among the stalks of corn. Major Willis was killed. Most of his men died beside him. By mid-morning, the detachment had effectively ceased to exist. For the young United States Army, the losses were catastrophic. 183 American soldiers were killed or missing. Another 31 were wounded. In a frontier army already stretched thin, this was an existential blow. Native losses are estimated between 100 and 120 warriors. A heavy cost, but one they believed necessary to defend their homeland. What is often overlooked is where much of this blood was spilled. These battles took place on Indiana soil, in fields, forests, and riverbanks that would later hold farms, towns, and highways. Hundreds of men died in a matter of days. This was one of the deadliest military episodes in early Indiana history. News of Harmar's defeat stunned the Washington administration. The United States, fresh off its revolution, had been decisively beaten by native forces it had underestimated. For the Confederacy, the victory was electrifying. Little Turtle became a legend. Raids against American settlements increased. Confidence surged. The message was clear. The United States could be beaten. But Washington was not done. The following year, he would authorize a larger, more ambitious campaign under Arthur St. Clair, a campaign that would end in an even worse disaster, the single greatest defeat the U.S. Army has ever suffered at the hands of indigenous forces. Harmar's defeat was not the end. It was a warning. Yet history has a way of circling back. 4 years later, in 1794, General Anthony Wayne would march into the same region with a disciplined army, hardened by relentless training. At the same Three Rivers site, Tecumseh, Wayne built a fort. That fort would grow into what we know today as Fort Wayne, Indiana. But beneath its streets lies the memory of a place where the United States first learned that conquest would not come easily, and where native nations proved they would fight, brilliantly and ferociously, for their survival. In the early morning darkness of November 7th, 1811, the forests of the Indiana Territory stirred with movement. Men crouched in the cold grass, muskets gripped with numb fingers. Somewhere beyond the tree line, warriors whispered prayers, not just for victory, but for survival. By sunrise, the ground would be slick with blood. A village would burn, and Indiana's future would be rewritten. This is the story of Tecumseh's War, and the battle that defined it, the Battle of Tippecanoe. At the dawn of the 19th century, Indiana was not yet a state. It was a contested frontier, tense, unstable, and simmering with conflict. White settlers poured westward, driven by land hunger and government-backed treaties. Native nations, already pushed to the brink, saw those same treaties as death warrants. The spark came in 1809 with the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison negotiated the purchase of nearly 3 million acres of native land, a staggering amount, by securing signatures from a handful of tribal leaders. But to many Native Americans, this treaty was illegal. One man stood at the center of that opposition: Tecumseh, a Shawnee war leader of rare charisma and vision. Tecumseh believed that native land belonged collectively to all tribes, not to be sold by any single nation under any circumstances. He called the treaty theft, fraud, an act of war. And he was not alone. By his side was his brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet. Once dismissed as a drunk and an outcast, Tenskwatawa reinvented himself as a spiritual leader, preaching a return to traditional ways and rejection of American influence. Together, the brothers founded Prophetstown near the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. Prophetstown became more than a village. It was a symbol, a sanctuary, a headquarters for resistance. Warriors from dozens of tribes, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Winnebago, and others, gathered there. Tecumseh dreamed of a united Native Confederacy that could halt American expansion once and for all. But in 1811, Tecumseh left Prophetstown. He traveled south, seeking alliances with the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and other nations. He warned them plainly, if the Americans were not stopped, no tribe would be safe. While Tecumseh was gone, Governor Harrison made his move. With roughly 1,000 men, about 250 U.S. Army regulars, and 700 Indiana and Kentucky militiamen, Harrison marched north toward Prophetstown. His goal was clear: intimidate, dismantle, and destroy the heart of Native resistance. Harrison claimed he sought peace, but both sides knew better. By November 6th, Harrison's forces camped on a low rise just outside Prophetstown. The soldiers formed a rough rectangle, muskets stacked, tents pitched. Harrison believed the high ground gave him the advantage. What he did not know was that hundreds of warriors watched silently from the surrounding woods. Tecumseh had ordered no attack, but that night Tenskwatawa took command. The prophet assured the warriors that his spiritual power would shield them, that American bullets would not harm them, that victory was destined. In the hours before dawn, warriors crept forward, faces painted, weapons ready. Just before sunrise, the forest erupted. The native warriors struck in a pre-dawn surprise assault, slamming into Harrison's encampment from multiple directions. Sleepy soldiers scrambled for weapons as musket fire tore through canvas tents. Horses screamed, men fell in the dark, unsure who or what was attacking them. The American lines buckled. At several points, warriors broke through, and the fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, knives, tomahawks, fists. Harrison, despite being nearly 60 years old, rode along the lines on horseback, shouting orders, rallying his men as bullets flew around him. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours. As dawn finally broke, the advantage shifted. American numbers, artillery, and discipline began to tell. With daylight exposing their positions and Tenskwatawa's promised invincibility proven tragically false, the warriors began to withdraw. By morning, the field belonged to Harrison. What followed was devastating. Harrison's men marched into Prophetstown and burned it to the ground. Homes, storehouses, and sacred spaces were reduced to ash. Even worse, the soldiers destroyed the village's winter food supplies, a deliberate act that ensured suffering long after the battle ended. The human cost was severe. 62 U.S. soldiers lay dead. Another 126 were wounded, many grievously. For the native Confederacy, estimates suggest 40 to 50 killed, with 70 to 80 wounded. Losses that struck especially hard because every fallen warrior represented a family, a community, and a future. The defeat shattered more than bodies. It shattered belief. Tenskwatawa's credibility was destroyed. His spiritual promises lay broken on the battlefield, and many warriors abandoned him in disillusionment. Though Tecumseh would continue fighting, eventually aligning with the British under the War of 1812, the dream of a unified native nation in the Midwest never recovered. For Indiana, the consequences were immediate and lasting. With Prophetstown destroyed and native resistance weakened, the path was cleared for rapid white settlement across northern Indiana. Farms replaced forests, towns replaced villages. Within just 5 years, in 1816, Indiana would be admitted as the 19th state in the Union. Nationally, the battle echoed even louder. Among the ruins of Prophetstown, Harrison's men found British-made weapons. To many Americans, this confirmed their suspicions that Great Britain was secretly backing native resistance in the West. Tippecanoe became a rallying cry, one of the key justifications for declaring the War of 1812. And for William Henry Harrison, the battle made him a legend. He became Old Tippecanoe, the frontier hero who had broken Tecumseh's Confederacy. Nearly 3 decades later, that single battle would carry him all the way to the White House, immortalized in one of the most famous campaign slogans in American history, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But for the native nations who lost their land, their homes, and their dead, Tippecanoe was not a slogan. It was a turning point toward dispossession. A reminder that Indiana's statehood, like so much of America's expansion, was built on fire, blood, and broken treaties. The battlefield still lies quiet today. Trees grow where muskets once flashed. The Tippecanoe River flows on, indifferent to the history along its banks. But if you listen closely, the echoes are still there. December 1812. the Indiana frontier is silent, but not peaceful. Snow blankets the forests along the Mississinewa River, muffling footsteps, hiding danger, and preserving the scars of a war that most Americans today barely remember, yet one that permanently reshaped Indiana. This is the War of 1812, and this is the Battle of the Mississinewa. In the winter of 1812, the Indiana Territory was a land on the brink. The United States had just suffered a humiliating defeat. Detroit had fallen to the British without a fight. Across the frontier, Native American resistance surged, inspired by leaders like Tecumseh and fueled by British promises. Fort Wayne was besieged. Fort Harrison barely survived. Settlers fled south or barricaded themselves inside crude blockhouses, waiting for violence. At the center of American anxiety stood the Miami Nation, whose villages line the Mississinewa River near present-day Marion, Indiana. Some Miami leaders, men like Jean-Baptiste Richardville and the Silver Heels, sought neutrality. They wanted survival, not annihilation. But General William Henry Harrison did not believe neutrality existed anymore. To him, these villages were not communities. They were threats. Harrison feared the Mississinewa villages were being used as staging grounds, harboring Shawnee and Potawatomi warriors who struck at American supply lines and vanished back into the forest. So he issued a brutal order, a punitive expedition. Lieutenant Colonel John B. Campbell was tasked with leading nearly 600 mounted troops from Fort Greenville straight into the heart of Miami Territory. The mission was clear: destroy the villages, burn the food, break resistance. By winter. The timing could not have been worse. Campbell's men marched through knee-deep snow, with temperatures plunging well below zero. Fingers went numb, beards froze solid, muskets jammed with ice. On December 17, 1812, the Americans reached the first village, Silver Heels Town. There was no warning. 8 native warriors were killed. 42 residents were taken prisoner, most of them women and children. Cabins were torched. Corn stores, the difference between life and death in winter, were destroyed. Livestock slaughtered or driven off. Then the column moved again. 3 more villages burned, their flames cutting through the frozen Indiana wilderness like beacons of terror. For the Miami people, winter had just become a death sentence. Before dawn on December 18th, the silence shattered. An estimated 300 Miami warriors surged out of the darkness, launching a surprise attack on Campbell's encampment. The fighting was savage and close, muskets flashing in the dark, cavalry scrambling to form lines as warriors pressed in from the snow-covered woods. For nearly an hour, the battle raged. At last, a coordinated cavalry charge broke the attack, scattering the warriors back into the frozen forest. The Americans held the field, but victory came at a terrible cost. Campbell feared Tecumseh was nearby with reinforcements. So, he ordered a retreat. What followed was not a march. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. More than 300 American soldiers were incapacitated by frostbite. Feet turned black, fingers snapped off. Men collapsed and were left behind or carried on horseback, screaming in pain. When the survivors reached Ohio, surgeons began amputations almost immediately, often without anesthesia. The battle had claimed fewer lives than the weather. Officially, U.S. losses from combat numbered around 8 killed and dozens wounded. But frostbite would maim far more than bullets ever did. For the Miami people, the consequences were even more devastating. Their winter food supplies were gone. Their homes were ashes. Families were scattered, imprisoned, or left to starve. Casualty numbers among Native communities were rarely recorded, but historians agree the death toll from exposure, hunger, and displacement far exceeded those killed in the fighting itself. Across Indiana during the War of 1812, dozens of settlers, militia members, and native civilians lost their lives in raids, sieges, and retaliatory strikes. But the Battle of the Mississinewa marked a turning point. It was the last time the Miami Nation fought as a unified military force in Indiana. After Mississinewa, resistance collapsed, not because of defeat in battle, but because survival became impossible. The battle's impact reshaped Indiana forever. First, Miami resistance was broken. Dependency replaced autonomy, as displaced communities were forced to rely on U.S. rations and treaties written under duress. Second, Harrison secured Indiana's northern frontier. With his flank protected, he could focus on retaking Detroit and pushing the war into Canada. And third, the path to statehood opened wide. With native military power neutralized, white settlements surged northward. Roads followed. Towns rose from ashes, not their own. Exactly 4 years later, in December 1816, Indiana became the 19th state. That timing was no coincidence. Today, the Battle of the Mississinewa is remembered each October near Marion, Indiana, during Mississinewa 1812, the largest War of 1812 living history event in the United States. Cannons fire, uniforms are worn, history is reenacted. But beneath the pageantry lies a harder truth. This was not just a battle. It was a winter campaign that weaponized starvation. A victory that cost limbs, homes, and entire ways of life. The snow eventually melted along the Mississinewa River, but the consequences never did. Wars, however, are not the only contributors of death and tragedy in Indiana's history. In the spring of 1913, Indiana learned a brutal lesson, one written not in textbooks, but in water, wreckage, and loss of life. This was not a single storm. It was not a freak cloudburst. It was something far worse. Over the course of just a few days, the state of Indiana was overwhelmed by the most catastrophic natural disaster in its recorded history, the Great Flood of 1913. By the time the waters finally receded, entire neighborhoods were gone. Bridges lay twisted in rivers, and between 100 and 200 Hoosiers were dead, many swept away without warning. Tonight, we are going back to that week in March when the rivers rose, the levees failed, and Indiana drowned. The winter of 1912 into early 1913 had already been wet. Snowmelt lingered in the soil, and the ground across much of Indiana was either frozen solid or completely saturated. Then, on March 23rd, the rain began, and it did not stop. Storm after storm stalled over the Ohio Valley, dumping 6 to 11 inches of rain across Indiana in just 5 days. That amount, nearly a quarter of the state's average annual rainfall, had nowhere to go. Creeks became rivers. Rivers became inland seas. The Wabash, White, and Mississinewa rivers rose faster than anyone believed possible. Faster than measurement, faster than memory, faster than fear could spread. By Easter weekend, Indiana was on the brink of catastrophe. The heart of the disaster beat loudest in Indianapolis. On March 26th, the White River surged to 19.5 feet above flood stage, pushing relentlessly against an earthen levee on the city's west side, a barrier never designed to face such pressure. Then it failed. Witnesses described a 25-foot wall of water tearing through West Indianapolis and Stroketown, neighborhoods packed with working-class families. Homes were lifted off foundations. Entire streets vanished beneath churning floodwaters in minutes. People fled to rooftops. Some climbed trees. Others did not escape at all. The Washington Street Bridge, the city's vital artery between downtown and the west side, collapsed into the river. With it went any easy escape or rescue route. Power stations flooded, water treatment plants shut down. For nearly 4 days, Indiana had no electricity, no clean water, and little communication with the outside world. And then, cruelly, the temperature dropped. Snow began to fall. Survivors, soaked and stranded, now faced hypothermia, clinging to debris while rescue workers navigated icy floodwaters by boat and lantern light. By the time the river finally crested, 7,000 families in Indianapolis alone had lost their homes. What happened in the capital was only one chapter of a statewide disaster. In Peru, Indiana, a town known proudly as the circus capital of the world, floodwaters swept through the famous Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus winter quarters. Nearly 500 animals, lions, tigers, horses, elephants, were trapped in cages and drowned. Their bodies later washed downstream, creating surreal and horrifying scenes that witnesses would never forget. In Terre Haute, the timing could not have been worse. Just days earlier, the city had been struck by one of the deadliest tornadoes in Indiana history. As residents were still digging out from that devastation, the Wabash River exploded beyond its banks, spreading 7 miles wide in places. Rescue boats floated over farmland, rail lines, and roads that no longer existed. Further north, Fort Wayne suffered its own reckoning at the confluence of the St. Mary's and Maumee rivers. Over 5,500 homes were damaged or destroyed. An estimated 15,000 people, nearly a third of the city, were suddenly homeless. Across Indiana, bridges vanished, railroads buckled, towns were isolated for days or weeks, relying on improvised rescues and sheer luck. Official casualty numbers struggled to keep up with reality. Bodies were swept miles downstream, never recovered. Entire families disappeared. In some communities, records were washed away along with the dead. Historians today estimate between 100 and 200 fatalities in Indiana alone, making the Great Flood of 1913 the deadliest natural disaster in the state's history. More than 200,000 people were left homeless statewide. Over 180 bridges were destroyed. Property damage was immense. And yet, for many survivors, the emotional toll was immeasurable. When the waters finally receded, Indiana faced a hard truth. This disaster had not been unavoidable. Local levees had failed. Warning systems were inadequate. River management was fragmented and uncoordinated. The flood forced change. Indiana established its first flood control commission, marking a new understanding that rivers could not simply be ignored or patched with temporary fixes. Nationally, the disaster helped pave the way for the Flood Control Act of 1917, the moment when the federal government formally accepted responsibility for managing major river systems. The reservoirs, dams, and floodways that now protect Indiana communities trace their origins back to this tragedy, to the lives lost in 1913. Today, the rivers that once drowned Indiana flow quietly through parks, cities, and farmland. It is easy to forget what they are capable of, but the Great Flood of 1913 remains a reminder, a warning etched into the state's history that nature does not negotiate, and preparation is written in lives, saved or lost. For the people who stood on rooftops, watched their towns disappear, or never made it out at all, the lesson came at an unbearable cost. March 18th, 1925. A date etched into the memory of the American Midwest. For residents of Indiana's southwest counties, it was a day that began like any other, but would end in unimaginable tragedy. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the tri-state tornado had left behind a trail of death and devastation that would forever alter the landscape of Posey, Gibson, and Pike counties. Often remembered for its catastrophic destruction in Illinois, the final act of the tri-state tornado in Indiana was no less violent. It tore through communities with a speed and ferocity that defies comprehension, leaving entire towns in ruins and hundreds of lives forever changed. Today, we will take you on a journey through that fateful afternoon, exploring the path of destruction, the harrowing toll, and the legacy left behind. The tornado crossed the Wabash River and entered Indiana around 4 p.m. local time, traveling at a staggering forward speed of roughly 73 miles per hour. The storm was almost impossible to outrun. Shrouded in a massive wall of rain and swirling dust, many residents did not even realize a tornado was approaching until it was far too late. For nearly a mile wide along its path, this spinning juggernaut of nature obliterated everything in its way. The first major Indiana community to face its wrath was the small town of Griffin in Posey County. Griffin, a tight-knit town of fewer than 400 souls, became ground zero for Indiana's encounter with the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. The destruction was total. 100% of the town's structures were wiped away. Homes, shops, barns, everything vanished in the storm's violent grip. In Griffin alone, approximately 25 lives were lost, and over 200 residents suffered injuries. That is more than 60% of the town's population directly affected, a staggering figure that underscores the tornado's merciless power. Families were torn apart, entire streets erased, and survivors would later describe the scene as something out of a nightmare. From Griffin, the tornado carved a path through the rural farmlands northwest of Owensville. Here, the destruction was equally chilling, though quieter in scale. Around 85 farms were devastated. Farmhouses were flattened, barns obliterated, and tragically, many farmers were killed in their fields or homes. In a grim statistic, more farmers lost their lives in this single afternoon than in the next 4 deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history combined. The storm's next major target was Princeton in Gibson County. The tornado struck the southern half of the city with intensity equivalent to an F5, the highest rating on the Tragedies scale. Witnesses described a wall of blackness that leveled roughly half the city. The southern industrial and residential districts bore the brunt, while the northern side remained unaware of the unfolding catastrophe. It was not until victims began arriving at the local hospital that the full scale of the destruction became apparent. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map. The storm did not discriminate. It struck homes, businesses, and factories with equal ferocity, leaving a wake of ruin that would take years to rebuild. By the time the tornado finally dissipated southwest of Petersburg in Pike County, approximately 4:30 p.m., Indiana had suffered an unimaginable loss. At least 71 people dead, with some estimates reaching 76. Families mourned loved ones, friends searched for survivors amid rubble, and entire communities faced the daunting task of beginning over from nothing. Yet the tornado's fury did not end with its passage. Heavy rains in the aftermath caused the Wabash River to flood, compounding the disaster. Roads were washed out, bridges destroyed, and relief efforts slowed to a crawl. Supplies from the American Red Cross and the Indiana National Guard could only reach survivors by boat or rail for nearly a week. For those trapped in Griffin and the surrounding areas, survival depended on ingenuity, courage, and sheer luck. The tri-state tornado's impact on Indiana extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. It became a benchmark for meteorologists and storm researchers. Modern reanalysis suggests that while the tornado was part of a continuous supercell storm system, the Indiana segment may have involved a slightly different vortex structure than the Illinois path. Regardless, its intensity remained at a maximum, a chilling reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. Historical markers now stand in Griffin and Princeton as a somber reminder of the 1925 disaster. They tell the stories of lives lost, communities forever altered, and a time when the very concept of weather forecasting was still in its infancy. At the time, the word tornado was banned from official forecasts to prevent public panic. But the sheer scale of the tri-state tornado changed everything. Policies were reevaluated, and the groundwork for modern tornado warning systems was laid. Systems that now save countless lives across the Midwest and beyond. The legacy of that day extends beyond statistics and meteorological studies. It is found in the resilience of communities, in the oral histories passed down from survivors, and in the landscapes that were forever reshaped. In southwestern Indiana, every time the wind rustles through the trees or the Wabash River swells after heavy rain, the memory of March 18, 1925 lingers, an enduring testament to the power of nature and the courage of those who faced it. So, as we reflect on the tri-state tornado in Indiana, we remember not just the numbers, the 71 to 76 lives lost, the hundreds injured, the towns erased, but the human spirit that endured. The storm may have left nothing but debris in its path, but it also left lessons learned, communities strengthened, and a legacy that continues to inform how we prepare for the next great tempest. Next, we journey back to a spring Sunday in 1965, a day that would forever change the way Americans understand and prepare for tornadoes, a day that remains Indiana's deadliest weather disaster, the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak. It was April 11th, 1965, a day that started like any other Palm Sunday. Families across the Midwest were attending church, enjoying the first hints of spring. Children played outside, parents tended gardens, and communities gathered in celebration. But hidden in the skies above the Midwest, a deadly storm system was brewing, a storm that would leave an indelible mark on Indiana and the nation. By the afternoon, the outbreak began in earnest. While 6 states were affected, Indiana would bear the brunt of the violence. In a single afternoon and evening, 10 tornadoes tore across the state, leaving destruction in their wake. By nightfall, Indiana would record 137 fatalities and over 1,200 injuries, with homes, businesses, and entire communities shattered. One of the most haunting images of that day came from Elkhart County in the small town of Dunlap. Residents there witnessed something incredibly rare and terrifying: a double funnel tornado. Imagine 2 massive tornadoes spinning around a common center, moving as one. Some modern experts believe this twister may have reached F5 intensity, the highest on the Fujita scale. Dunlap would endure a double blow unlike any other. The first tornado struck the Midway Trailer Court, leveling nearly every home. 10 people lost their lives in an instant. And as survivors began to comprehend the devastation, a second, even more powerful tornado tore through the Sunnyside subdivision, claiming 36 more lives. Families who had survived the first strike were trapped in the horror of the second. Nearby towns suffered as well. Wakarusa, Goshen, and La Paz faced the full fury of the outbreak. Homes were not just damaged, they were completely swept off their foundations, leaving only concrete slabs in their place. Entire neighborhoods were erased from the map in what could only be described as surreal destruction. While northern Indiana endured the deadliest strikes, central Indiana faced its own nightmare. A mile-wide tornado carved a path nearly 50 miles long, leaving devastation in towns like Russiaville and Kokomo. Russiaville was hit so hard it was nearly erased from the map. About 90% of its structures were damaged or destroyed, leaving residents homeless and in shock. Further along the storm's path, Kokomo and the neighboring town of Alto saw hundreds of homes destroyed. Casualties mounted, including at a local truck stop where motorists had sought shelter, only to find that the storm spared no one in its path. The tornado system pressed on eastward, striking Marion and Greentown before finally dissipating near the Ohio border. By the end of the day, Indiana had experienced 10 significant tornadoes, 8 of which reached F4 intensity. The human toll was staggering. In total, 137 people were killed. More than 1,200 were injured, and countless families were left without homes. Churches, schools, and workplaces were reduced to rubble. For many, this Palm Sunday would be remembered not for celebration, but for unimaginable loss. Yet amid this tragedy, the disaster prompted a revolution in the way the United States approached severe weather warnings. Despite meteorologists accurately forecasting the storms, many Hoosiers never received warnings. It was a spring holiday. Families were outdoors or in churches. When tornadoes struck, power and telephone lines were down, cutting off critical communication. The aftermath of April 11, 1965 led to several critical changes that have saved countless lives in the decades since. First, civil defense sirens, once intended solely for nuclear air raids, began to be used to warn communities of approaching tornadoes. Their blaring, urgent sound became a signal for citizens to seek shelter immediately. Second, the Palm Sunday outbreak highlighted the need for trained human spotters. This led to the creation of Skywarn, a volunteer network of trained storm spotters who relay real-time reports of severe weather to the National Weather Service. Their observations help forecasters issue warnings faster and more accurately than ever before. Finally, the tragedy underscored the importance of clear, standardized language. Before 1965, terms like tornado warning and watch were inconsistently applied, leaving many unsure how to react. In the wake of the disaster, the terminology was standardized, ensuring that the public could distinguish between a potential threat and an imminent danger, knowledge that is now second nature in storm-prone regions. The Palm Sunday tornado outbreak remains a somber reminder of nature's power and of the importance of preparedness. It reminds us that while we cannot control the weather, we can control how we respond to it. Families who perished that day could not have imagined the horrors awaiting them, but their suffering was not in vain. Their legacy lives on in sirens, spotters, and warnings that continue to protect millions every year. As we remember the victims of April 11, 1965, it is impossible not to feel the weight of their stories. From the double funnel tornado in Dunlap to the destruction in Kokomo, this disaster reshaped Indiana and the nation's approach to severe weather. It is a story of loss, yes, but also of resilience, innovation, and a community's commitment to ensuring that future generations are safer. So the next time you hear a tornado siren or a weather alert, remember the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak. Remember the families, the communities, and the lives forever altered on that fateful day. And remember that in the face of nature's fury, preparation, awareness, and action can make the difference between life and death. April 3rd, 1974. A day that began like any other in Indiana quickly became a nightmare etched forever into the state's memory. The sky darkened as an unprecedented storm system moved in, setting the stage for what would become the most violent tornado outbreak in American history, the super outbreak. Over the next 24 hours, 148 tornadoes would tear through 13 states. But Indiana would bear a disproportionate share of the fury. 21 tornadoes touched down across the Hoosier State. 47 people lost their lives. Over 900 were injured, and more than a third of Indiana's counties would later receive federal disaster declarations. Today, we revisit that day, the day the sky turned black. Meteorologists describe the morning of April 3rd as nothing short of extraordinary. A massive, low-pressure system hovered over the Midwest, colliding with warm, moist air streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico. By midday, the atmosphere over Indiana was so unstable, so volatile, that for the first and only time in U.S. history, a blanket tornado warning was issued for the entire state. Every Hoosier had just moments to prepare for the unimaginable. And yet, nothing could have truly prepared them for what came next. The outbreak was marked by what meteorologists call tornado families. These are multiple tornadoes spawned from the same parent supercell, each one a spinning, destructive force of nature. Many of the tornadoes in Indiana reached F4 or F5 intensity on the Tragedies scale, the most violent category possible. Let us start with the Monticello tornado, an F4 behemoth and the longest tracked tornado of the entire outbreak. Stretching an astounding 109 miles, and decimated Monticello's downtown district and destroyed the courthouse. 19 lives were lost, and the tornado continued to carve a path of destruction through Rochester and Ligonier. Families were left homeless, businesses obliterated, and a community forever scarred. Next, the DePauw tornado, an F5, the first of the day. Southern Indiana would never forget it. Entire homes in DePauw and Daisy Hill were literally swept away. Witnesses reported seeing cars tossed into basements after the very houses they were in had been destroyed. The sheer power of this tornado was almost incomprehensible, a moving reminder that nature's forces are both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Madison and Hanover areas along the Ohio River were struck by not one, but two F4 tornadoes. Hanover College, a historic institution nestled in the region, sustained severe damage. Remarkably, there were no fatalities on campus, but the surrounding communities were not so fortunate. 11 lives were lost, hundreds injured, and countless families faced the aftermath of loss and devastation. To put it into perspective, Indiana's toll from that single day was staggering. 47 fatalities, over 900 injuries, 45 counties affected, 6 violent tornadoes rated F4 or F5. The super outbreak changed Indiana in profound ways. Homes and towns were rebuilt, but so too was the understanding of the science behind these storms. Dr. Ted Fujita, a pioneering meteorologist, spent months studying the paths of destruction in Indiana. It was here that he discovered downbursts and microbursts, powerful downdrafts capable of wreaking havoc rivaling a tornado. He also documented multiple vortex tornadoes, explaining why a single home could be leveled, while a neighbor stood untouched. This research would forever alter the field of meteorology and fundamentally improve forecasting and safety measures across the United States. Today, Indiana's emergency sirens and its highly organized National Weather Service spotter networks trace their roots directly to the lessons learned during that devastating April. But beyond the science and the statistics, there are the human stories. The families who lost everything in an instant, neighbors helping neighbors sift through debris, and communities coming together to rebuild from the wreckage. In Monticello, survivors recount the harrowing experience of seeing the courthouse collapse before their eyes, yet finding hope in the solidarity of friends and strangers alike. In Madison, stories of Hanover College students helping to clear debris and provide aid to local families highlight the resilience of the human spirit amidst catastrophe. The super outbreak of 1974 serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of nature's unpredictable power. For meteorologists, it was a watershed moment, leading to breakthroughs in storm prediction and safety protocols. For the people of Indiana, it was a day of horror, survival, and ultimately resilience. Even decades later, the legacy of April 3rd remains visible across the state. Communities have rebuilt, but scars remain in the landscape and memories, and in the lessons passed down from generation to generation. The sirens still wail, the weather alerts still flash, and the stories of that day continue to be told. ensuring that the lives lost and lessons learned are never forgotten. So, as we remember the super outbreak, we honor not only the 47 Hoosiers who perished and the hundreds who survived with injuries and trauma, but also the spirit of a state that faced one of the most violent tornado events in American history and lived to tell the story. April 3rd, 1974, a day the sky turned black, yet in the darkness, the resilience of Indiana shone through. Thank you for joining us today as we revisited these historic events that helped shape the state of Indiana. Remember these tragedies, both conflict-driven and natural, and remember the lives lost and the lessons learned. For if we allow ourselves to forget our history, we will inevitably forget the lessons learned and be thusly doomed to repeat old mistakes. This concludes Episode 3, Part 1 of Seekers of Otherworldly and Unknown Legends. These tragedies have left their mark on the earth, the lives of those who walk it, and perhaps on the unseen veil that surrounds us. What creatures might these events have allowed to slip through into our dimension? Find out next time as we continue our journey into the unknown. Thanks again for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share. This really does go a long way in keeping the channel going, so I can continue to keep these stories alive. And I really appreciate everyone out there who is giving me a chance to learn and improve with every episode. Have a great night, and I'll see you next week.